koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko kai Coleman tapu ingoa. It's being in karakia. This karakia comes from Whakaare Aotearoa, my colleagues at Drama New Zealand. Haki roto, haki waho, kia tau te Māori e kōkere nei, I ngā piki me ngā eke, ko rangimari e taku e rupu nei. Through the ups and the downs, let's breathe in, breathe out. Tihei Māori ora. All right. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at the Timotaihou framework, which I'll be honest, I almost missed the fact that they were consulting on this document, or that this was in fact still in draft when all the material came out around consultation. And so, yeah, I suddenly went, oh yeah, this is still a draft as well. And in terms of the consultation documents around this, it's slightly different to what we've looked at before with the learning areas in terms of the questions they're asking you and obviously what we're going to be looking at. So again, as ever, I'm going to take you through the kind of guide to the consultation questions and then a little summary of some of the key issues that we've gathered around the framework, and a little bit of a look at comparison between the 2023 draft and the 2025. And that's where I thought we'd start this afternoon session, actually, if you don't mind. I thought we'd start with Dr. Wainata's original 2023 video, because I think it is worth thinking about how this curriculum refresh work started, and where that, where some of the te reo that kupu Māori has come from and the meaning behind those words and the mana of those involved in its original conception. So I'm going to try sharing my screen with that video, and hopefully it will work. Please sing out if not. I did check by the Substack what it said to me today about how to do this. But as ever, the proof is in the doing. So yes, if you'll bear with me, we're just going to hear from Wainata on the original. We can't get the video. Right. It's not what I told me it was going to be. Okay, my apologies there for the lack of sound. Something to learn for next time. But yeah, I thought it was really important to go back to that, to remember kind of where we came from, and also to have Dr. Wenata unpack the depths of meaning behind some of the terminology that we are still seeing in the 2025 version. All right, let's share the next bit with you. So we're going to do very much the same. I'll look at the consultation framing. Look at that a little bit longer because it's different to what we've looked at for the learning areas, and then we'll go and look at the snapshot summary of the key issues. So again, on the website, for those of you who want to have a look later, this will go up as ever. And again, drew on the snapshot, again, drew on other expert thinking, not just my own thoughts, although I have many. Here we'll go to that summary in a moment, where this is where we can look at the framework, and this is where you can look at the consultation document. And again, they're quite tricky to find, so I think those buttons should be really helpful. So in the consultation, they're really, the questions are quite narrowed, I feel, in terms of what they're asking us about. They are very different in some ways in terms of the scope, I think, from the original conception around what Te Mataia was. But as ever, you do have a section in the consultation to add your own commentary, to upload your own feedback that you want to comment on, even if it's not being asked for in these questions. And so I have just popped down here again how those terms have now been defined in the 2025 document, though I have flipped it, so te reo first. And as ever, there are some support materials down here that you can click on in that video that we just watched. So there's a nice comparison document here, which we will look at as well, and a little bit of further reading on Te Mataia. Okay, so I think, what I might do is just look at the framework first and script through that quickly, and then come back to the snapshot document. So the whole thing is now actually just, you can scroll through the whole thing. You don't have to download something, unlike the learning areas. Those of you who are familiar with the 2023 draft will see there's quite a lot of change, quite a lot of variation in terms of not only the content, but also the imagery and the layout. You can see here this kind of more hierarchical learning structure, I guess. But we have a shift that has happened, I think, when they were in the midst of this, is the addition of capabilities, which for a time were not visible in the learning area and in the learning area structure, and are now down the side. So the purpose around here, again, mātauranga, equity and excellence this time, content, this kind of more disciplinary focus, and again, this terminology around what knowledge rich is, quite different to the holistic well-being focus of the 2023 document. It has, again, gone back to and retained some capabilities that were woven into and woven alongside. And now, as you can see in this learning structure, are more sort of on the side of everything else, rather than woven and included as part of the learning areas themselves. It talks about the requirements around literacy and maths. It talks around the timing requirements now, the way that we might design teaching, and some of the new assessment progress markers that we've seen in the assessment materials that have been shared with parents more recently. Here, in terms of the learning connection points, again, the framing and just the imagery here, you'll notice looks quite different to what we had with the original Te Mataia. And then the learning areas, we have some slight changes. You'll notice on the arts, we talked about this in our arts version, the requirements are different and the timings are different to what we currently have, and that you only have to go forward with one art form into years 9 and 10, as opposed to exploring all 4 art forms. There's some conversation about flexibility and choice. There's the issue of the time allocations of the learning areas, so how much time you should be assigning to each one. Again, that's I think putting in a very different sort of sensibility about things, um, and some more detailed definition around what they consider effective teaching and planning to look like. So we've got this notion of explicit teaching, which I think has been conflated with a sort of didactic way of teaching, as opposed to the notion of intentional teaching, which can form with many different forms. And this lays out how each sequence is going to look. I'm whisking through because I'm seeing the time. And then here again, we sort of got the statement about sense of belonging and being valued and being responsive. But it is kind of an added on statement here, as opposed to thinking about how that aligns with this sort of explicit teaching and very prescriptive model that we've seen in the learning areas. So creating responsive learning environments, I think, poses an extra challenge with learning areas that are so prescriptive and so content heavy, and so don't leave space for localized curriculum in the same way that our original Tūmataiho draft did. We've got a lot around the assessment data, and that's a lot of the things that have been coming out in terms of these new progress descriptors. But some of the original terminology around, things that were hoped for in terms of relationship do remain. I just think, again, there's probably one of the chief critiques, and we're going to come to that now, is around how coherent that is in terms of how it's realized through the actual work. Okay, we will now go to, so if you then see here, you click on here and you'll find the survey documents. Again, this is the same sort of Survey Monkey, but with those slightly different questions, which we will now go and look at in the summary of key issues. So we click on this first button up here. Yes, please, we'd like to continue. All right, so the first question it asks you, Strategy number question 8, is whether or not it's delivering a knowledge-rich curriculum. And again, this is coming from across the other learning areas, that essentially the answer to that is no. Whilst there's an intention around knowledge-rich, and again, I would argue the definition of that is lacking. Most of the learning areas have felt that the content amount has been confused for having intellectual rigor. So it's full of content, but not necessarily knowledge-rich. And it's a very kind of narrowed scope of what we think about knowledge, not deep, rich understandings about the world, but more actual, concrete, kind of declarative facts. And again, that notion that having that high level of prescription is going to be really difficult to allow for equity in terms of the variability of location of schools, the resourcing of schools, the expertise that they may have within their areas. So we've got some examples of that from a couple of the learning areas around knowledge, about, again, what knowledge has now been defined as and what it considers to be essential. The arts, talking about that sort of very white middle class knowledge, it is positioned as exclusively the knowledge. Social sciences, if you were in that learning area webinar, they talked very much again around history being sort of a Western development of, democracy and Socrates and Greek European imperialism, and that's where the bulk of the time is being spent. And the loss really of Mātauranga Māori knowledge and a recognition of that as a foundational place, particularly to us in Aotearoa, and our commitment to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So Mātauranga Māori has kind of been tacked on in places, and that's changed very much our understanding of knowledges. Does Tūmataiho make clear what schools must teach? I think there is an increased specificity, and there's an acknowledgement that might be really helpful to our early career teachers, because it gives them, a really very pinpointed on exactly the thing that they need to be teaching. The difficulty with that, of course, is that it is limiting in lots of respects, and also it's not coherently done across all of the learning areas. And we've looked at that across the webinars, that they'd have different organising structures, so capacity and ability to do integration, places that, more experienced teachers are going to be able to really seize and be responsive to their learners, that space is now not allowed, or there's no allowance for that. There's no affordances for that. And a couple of examples here talking about the ways that the different learning areas have been organised in ways that don't make sense, essentially, to those learning areas. Does it support delivery for all learners? This is a real area of main concern, I think, for me, about the change to the framing and how that's then impacted on all of the learning areas, is that this kind of confusion between explicit teaching, which can take many forms, intentional explicit teaching that can take many forms, and kind of direct instruction, that we should all be learning everything through direct instruction all the time. And a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, not only to our learners and the diverse groups of learners that we have, but also to our learning areas. And that's in contrast to what best evidence tells us about practice in those learning areas. Across all the learning areas, there's a real loss of the significance of our applied learning. So again, thinking about the variety of learners that we have and what they're going to be interested in doing and what our contexts and spaces are going to be available to us. Limiting that ability to engage really in practical learning and sidelining that, which is a lot of the time in the arts and embodied practice and health and PE and many of the other learning areas. A lot of the time we are learning through doing things and through that embodied cognition, and there's not places for that. So that's a limitation as well. The differentiation question and how this framework, which is now a year-by-year framework and is very, it's mandating across the idea that you are learning at this year level, regardless of what year level you might have come into school at, or whether or not you're new to the country, or whether or not you are a gifted and talented young person who's jumped ahead. The idea is that all classrooms are going to teach the same levels, and I think that's going to be quite difficult. And then again, this notion that Mātauranga Māori has been sort of thrown in randomly. So bits of tokenistic te reo in places. The structure and the design of this framework is still very much coming from a particular worldview, and it excludes a te ao Māori lens, and it does not demonstrate how a bicultural teaching can be authentically realised across subjects. And we know how much from Nellie Betterman's research and others, how important it is to have those relationship building, that kind of strong sense of ako and reciprocal teaching that we get through in working in a Mātauranga Māori way, and how wonderfully that works for all learners. So what's gone? Well, I think the purpose, a lot of the groups in the webinars talked about the purpose of each learning area has seemingly been lost. It's more about these are the things we want you to learn, but there's no sense of the why. The position of students as agentic, as having a part to play in their own learning journey and capable of taking action and capable of managing things themselves, that seems to have been removed. It's a much more teacher-centric document. Some of the challenges of the future challenges of the world in terms of climate change, in terms of our development of critical literacy, and I would say critical feeling, thinking about the role of generative AI, those crucial kind of hot button issues, I think, about the world that we're currently in are not there. And alongside that, the development of essential capabilities for the 22nd century. So thinking about creativity, our resilience, our ability to collaborate, these are big, globally acknowledged and important capabilities, and they aren't really very present within this framework or within the learning areas as well. So not woven in. And across the learning area, this idea that the sort of students are now being taught what to know rather than how they might think within each discipline. What is the nature of each learning area? So it's kind of reducing that, again, that life-worthy learning. Why am I engaging in this learning? Down to sort of a collection of stuff I've collected. But then how transferable is that? So we wanted to build conceptual understanding, and this is what all of the education research will talk about OECD 2030 plans, about future learners, building really deep conceptual understanding along with knowledge. They need to know things to do that, but then they can transfer those concepts across different contexts. So they do need knowledge, but they need so much more. And again, that concern about Mātauranga Māori and its core understandings being reduced to varying things. Yes, Kate. And so I think this is a handy table. This is the AEC's table, and there's a link in this document to the article that goes along with it. I did a similar thing myself to look at the comparison between the 2023 draft and the version that we've got now and some of those shifts. And I think you can see a really significant ideological shift about what the purpose of education might be. And that's sort of impacted across all of the learning areas to varying extents. And I would argue that some of the things that they have, that this version is suggesting it's going to do in terms of greater coherence is not actually working at all because of the fact these learning areas are so kind of seemingly disparate and do not have a cohesive whole, a cohesive centre. I must say for myself, when I was working in the previously under the previous Te Mataiaho version, and we were working in the refresh, it was a sense that it was a refresh, not a complete rewrite. And one of the reasons that we worked alongside colleagues in science and in technology is that while we are distinct learning areas, there was a sense that we were all part of a whole, we were all part of a cohesive thing that was going to sit within this framework. And this very much more feels like a kind of layered on thing at the end, in a similar way to the way that perhaps for 2007, it's like a front and a back end of the book. So I think that this is the real concern, that these learning areas are not held together in a cohesive way with a really well-grounded basis. So I guess overall, my concern is that this is going backwards in terms of our curriculum frameworks. There's an overwhelming amount of content in our learning areas. There's the kind of real guts of the soul, I would say, of why we engage in education and engage in learning is missing. And some of the samples of materials that we've received from through both the framework and the learning areas are really not great quality. Concern here is that this curriculum as implemented will narrow what students know. It will limit what teachers can do. It's going to reduce a teacher autonomy and their professional capability because if we are using very heavily prescribed materials, teachers will no longer have to be curriculum designers and won't have the opportunities to be responsive in that lovely, rich way that they are with their knowledge of the learning areas and their knowledge of the community and the context and the children in front of them. They won't be able to, they'll be doing those things anymore and will potentially lose that capability. Increasing inequities, because again, this is a one-size-fits-all approach. Everyone's going to do the same thing in the same way. But obviously, as we know, joyfully, our children in our spaces are very different. The recolonizing concerns that a lot of the material is coming from a very narrowed part of the world and a very kind of narrow view of that part of the world, and has lost a lot of the Aotearoa element and the Mātauranga Māori and the wonderful rich learning and opportunity that we have through that bicultural lens, and will marginalize a lot of our diverse communities as well. So reducing the richness and the relevance and the joy, I think, is probably the bit that really worries me. New Zealand have been recognised for curriculum frameworks that were conceptually sophisticated. We knew there was something that needed to be done with refreshing it. We knew we needed to embed some more knowledge into those things. But this seems to have gone very far over into kind of content-heavy, transmission-based, and it's not supported by our international research. So I think I will stop there and just go back over to that framework sharing. Well, she says, what am I sharing now? I'll go back. Okay, so as I said, in the consultation document, it really does ask you some pretty narrow questions about, does it say it's doing this thing? Does it say it's telling them what to do? Does it make clear? It's a lot about does it make clear, as opposed to asking you about how you feel about that and whether or not you think that's appropriate for for your schools and for the sector? And do you think this is a quality, coherent framing that really sets up the learning areas and the ways that you are going to work successfully in schools? But that doesn't mean you can't answer that question. And I would encourage you in the survey document to, when it gets to that sort of any other bit, fill in that bit, and feel free to upload a PDF of any other critiques and challenges that you might want to make. So I will leave it there for the afternoon. Thank you for coming to our last session of webinars on the curriculum consultation. I don't know what I'll be doing next in this regard, but something I've no doubt. So keep an eye out for that. And thank you, those of you that have shared this with other people and encouraged them to attend. I do hope you make a submission. I hope you encourage your colleagues, friends, parents, whānau. This is a community, everyone issue. And people need to be aware of what's going on. Let me, karakia our way out of here. Let's do this one. I know it's more of an intro one, but I feel like peaceful. Kia hora te marinu, kia whakapapapōnamo te moana, hei hui rahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Araha atu, araha mai. Tātou e tātou katoa, hui e tāki e. Because we're all together in this, my friends. And that is what gives me great hope. And energy, that we can still be joyful, we will still be joyful, and we will find our way through this. But absolutely, we need to say what we know and we need to make our voices heard. So please go forward and do that. Thank you, Kate, for your beautiful comment. I really appreciate it. Sometimes it feels very strange just talking into the void. But yes, I will pop this video up as ever. It will go straight into the Substack, and then I will pop it onto my bigger page as well. And I'll pop the links in as well, so people have got time to check it out. And yeah, take care, everyone. Ka kite. Thank you, Tim. All right. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Ka kite.